Hello everyone, this is Venom Geek Media here, and here we are to compare the Vulcan and Andorian fleets of the 22nd century. We've been looking at the Dakia and the Kamari, the flagship classes. Last week we looked at the other classes that make up their respective fleets, and this week we're going to match them off against one another. So let's get into it. So I'll just say that I'm going to compare on a ship-to-ship basis, so matching each ship class / type off against one another, compare strengths and weaknesses and blind spots, work out really in a war between Andoria and Vulcan who was going to win, and comparing the various units and capabilities. So let's get into it. So obviously, like before, we'll work from the smallest to the biggest. So the first thing to point out with the Vulcans is that they have two small ships before we get to any Andorian ships. That's the Deval and the Vulcus. The Deval is cheap, fast, going to be cheaper than any of the Andorian ships. There's no observed Andorian equivalent, and it could potentially be very effective swarming and attacking larger Andorian vessels. You look at the size of it compared to Andorian ships, it's very small and it would be a very difficult target, particularly if attacking in numbers. Certainly it would pose a significant annoyance. It also means that if any time you're making a pass at a Vulcan capital ship, you've got to contend with these things coming back at you, getting in your face and chipping away at your flanks. So it's going to make attacking much harder. It forms something of a defensive barrier around the Vulcan capital ships. The Vulcus is a torpedo boat. It's old. It augments the capabilities of any unit that it's part of, but fundamentally it is going to be outclassed by the Illithin, which is the first Andorian ship we'll cover. The Illithin is a modern torpedo boat, and it was built from the ground up to be that. It's newer than the Vulcus, it has a lot of advanced capabilities, so not only can it use photonic torpedoes it can probably use them to create sensor screens, jamming, area of effect weapons, various types of torpedo warhead that are in use in the 22nd century, similar kind of tactics that we saw in the Romulan Earth War. Now, there is some problems with the Illithin. It's a lot more expensive than a Vulcus, and it's also not the most agile or maneuverable ship. As I say, it's got related DNA to the Kival, so it's quite clumsy. Individually, on its own, the Illithin is not going to do very well. This is a ship that does need the support of the other vessels in the fleet, unlike the Deval and the Vulcus, which, when you pair them together, can actually be a pretty effective little skirmish unit on their own. The same can't really be said for the Illithin. So next one to go up to then is, of course, looking at it compared to the Surak class, which is obviously bigger, it's more powerful, faster, doesn't have any torpedoes, so the Illithin could have some use against a Surak. It's a good way to augment your light forces. It's a small capital grade ship, it's a small cruiser, so it brings that level of firepower. So, as a way of protecting the smaller ships, yeah, it's pretty effective. Again, it would be a big target for the Illithin, and a very easy target for the Illithin, because it's also probably older, weaker shielding. Andorian torpedo boats might just take that out. So the Celtra is, of course, a very light, very maneuverable little light cruiser. Now, facing off against the Surak, which is obviously its main equivalent, the Celtra actually has some problems. It's good, it's maneuverable, and it is probably more advanced than the Surak, but you're still not going to want to get too close to a Surak class vessel. So I would definitely hand the advantage to the Celtra. After the Surak, we of course get to the Kumari. It's a very good battle cruiser, good long-range capability, well-rounded in terms of its different weapons, and quite agile as well. Its main blind spot is that it lacks ordnance. It doesn't have any kind of heavy weapons, so to speak. It's running everything on its particle cannons, which is fine as long as it doesn't come under attack by ordnance-equipped vessels. So particularly for the Kamari, the big threats are going to be the Valkas and the Sharan. Those are the two ships that are going to really threaten the Kumari, and kind of why you then need the Ilithans. But then, of course, what the Ilithan is then doing is engaging in a torpedo duel rather than what it really should be doing, which is, targeting vulnerable ships with torpedoes. When you engage in a torpedo duel, you've basically neutralized one another's torpedo-armed vessels. It's going to make the battle overall less decisive. So that is a bit of a problem with the Kumari. With the Kumari, you have a decent battle cruiser, good strafing run, good match of speed and agility, and well armoured. I'm not so sure that I could really call the fight in favour of either Kumari or the Sharan. I would definitely favour the Kumari over a Surak. It's bigger than the Surak and newer than the Surak. But I'm not so sure it would do so well against the Sharan. But I equally don't think the Sharan has a colossal advantage in its favour. The Sharan does actually have torpedoes, and that might actually give it the edge against a Kumari. But equally, Vulcans are still very reliant on their plasma cannons. Now, that being said, you still have a decent amount of maneuverability when facing off against something like the Sharan. The Sharan and Surak are probably the least maneuverable ships, if not in the Vulcan fleet, then in the entire quadrant. They're not maneuverable. And that's partially reflective of the fact that they are not intended for an actual peer engagement. They're intended to use their weapons to scare the enemy off. So, bearing that in mind, when you come to something like a Kumari against a Sharan, I think that's actually a very, very even fight. The Sharan has torpedoes and it has powerful plasma cannons, but that's not going to phase the Kumari that much. The Kumari is not an easily phased vessel, and it could well do you a lot of damage. So it's difficult to hand the battle to either one. I'd almost consider erring on the side of the Kumari, possibly, just because of the level of aggression that it's going to be able to exert compared to the Sharan, which can just fly in a straight line. I would probably say very concretely that an isolated Sharan would be a very easy target for a Kumari or two. Okay, next up is, of course, the Keval. I haven't decided on what pronunciation I like. You've got a mix of torpedoes and particle cannons. Like all Andorian ships, it's costly. It's slow. It handles well. That's what I will say. I won't say it's maneuverable. I will say that it handles well and can move about an engagement in pretty close range. This is a dedicated armoured brawler. Is the Keval really intended to actually win an engagement with a Dakir, or is it actually just intended to survive it? I actually think it's probably the latter. I have a feeling that actually the Keval is actually designed to tie down Vulcan ships, tie down ships like the Dakir in a close quarter combat, and mean that they're spending all of their firepower and attention on dealing with them rather than dealing with the faster, more maneuverable Andorian ships or the more vulnerable torpedo boats. So I think that's really where the Keval fits in. It's not necessarily there to be the damage dealer. It's the attention grabber. It's a massive distraction. And as long as it's, again, decently supported and knows what it's doing, one-on-one, happily tangle with the Dakir. Yeah, when you start talking about 2-on-1s and 3 and 4-on-1s, yeah, you're getting into real trouble there. I'd say individually, one-on-one, it's enough to tie down a Dakir, and that gives you the chance to deal with all the things that will come with a Dakir, like the Deval, like the Valkas. That's kind of, I think, the essential quality, is you've got to almost peel the onion. You've got to, if you consider the Vulcan battle groups, the Dakir battle groups, as an onion of various capabilities and defenses, you've got to peel away at each of them before you can get to the nucleus, the Dakir itself. Talking about the Dakir from the Vulcan perspective, you have this dreadnought. It's incredibly powerful. It's going to be very good, actually. Less so on brawling one-on-one with any particular ship, but being just a base of fire, being capable of crowd control and handling multiple enemies, Your main problem is that it lacks ordnance. It doesn't have photonic torpedoes. It can 1v1 most targets, but again, in a 1v1, actually, against most ships of the period, the Dakir is going to be quite slow and ponderous. What it actually wants to do is sit in the middle of the battle space and shoot at everything, and be commanding sort of from the front. Again, think about it as the nucleus of the Vulcan battle group. The most important thing to pay attention to with the Dakir is that it is going to be very, very vulnerable to torpedo attack. That is going to be your best chance against the Dakir, is using your torpedoes at long range. And there's very little for it to respond to itself, but that's why it has its battle group. So what I think I'll do here is actually I'll identify a couple ships that for me are real standouts as posing real problems to the other. So for the Andorians, I think a real big problem is going to be posed by the Deval. That is a very, very big problem because it is very small, very agile, very maneuverable, very difficult target. The Vulcans have a lot of them, and they can attack pretty much any of your ships with a lot of impunity. You're going to have to devote a lot of effort to just countering this without having a specific class to counter it. You're going to have to, rely on everyone mucking in to deal with the Deval. The other problem class I could see being for the Andorians would be the Dakir, which is kind of obvious. This is the Vulcan Dreadnought. It is their main warship. It should be a problem. The Sharan and the Surak, they're nice, but fundamentally they are not warships, and so they aren't necessarily designed to pose as much of a problem. Whereas the Dakir really is a warship, and it does pose a problem to you. And I would say that, for the Andorians, that's going to be a real big concern. You want to isolate the Dakir and match it off against probably a combination of the Elithin and the Kumari. Isolate the Dakirs, torpedoes away from the Elithin. Happy days. From the Vulcan perspective, the problem ships are going to be the Elithin. It's a very good, very advanced torpedo boat. And probably the Kumari. The Kival is just going to, it's a distraction. And you may well work it out to be a distraction. It's not going to do anything you don't expect. It's a big, bulky, simple battleship in that respect. So you can kind of predict what's going to happen with that. Similarly with the Celtra, you've got a ship that is, you know what it's going to try and do. You know it's going to try and get around your flanks. You know it's going to try and skirmish. And you know it's going to go for your lighter vessels. So they need to hug their larger supporting cruisers to protect them. The problem you get with the Kumari and the Elithin is a torpedo threat that is very difficult to counter. And from the Kumari, some very, very long range particle cannons and a lot of agility. These are going to be two ships that are very difficult to individually tie down. Now, both of their vulnerabilities, I would say the Deval is going to be a great counter for the Elithin, or indeed the Surak is probably going to be a good counter for the Elithin. There are counters and there are things you can do. If you keep close formation, you're going to make life very difficult for the Kamaris to get in there. So again, there's counters and there's counters, but in terms of ships that are forcing you to change how you fight and forcing you to adapt on the fly, those are the two big worries for the Vulcans. Right, I think finally, just before we close out, I'd like to talk briefly about the engagement we see in the Enterprise 3-parter, the Kishara, and looking at, what do we see here, and from what we have now learned, what can we apply to this engagement? Obviously, sans the Enterprise, without the Enterprise, what kind of engagement are we looking at? So looking at this matchup, you have 4 Dakirs, 3 Valkas, and 3 Devals. I did count. 4 against 4 Kumaris and 2 Elithins. you can see pretty clearly this battle is going to advantage the Vulcans. Now, equally, I don't think that it was going to be an absolute crushing defeat for the Andorians, and that seems to be reflected in the episode. The Andorians hold off the Vulcans, although they are taking absolute pummeling. Really, what the problems here are going to be is a lack of counter to the Davals. The Davals are going to basically neutralize the Ilithins. They're not going to be able to torpedo away at the Dakirs, or indeed, a matchup that they'd really like to have is against the Volcas. But again, they're not going to be able to get that matchup because they've got these little shits just swarming them and causing them such problems. At the same time, you really can't get any help from your Kumaris because the Kumaris are going to be busy engaged with the Dakirs. You've got to bear in mind, the goal of this Andorian fleet is not to destroy the Vulcan ships, it's to stop them. It's to stop them, which is very different. So you can't let any through. So you've got to manage this engagement in such a way that you keep them occupied for as long as possible until your reinforcements get there. Now, I think if Andorian reinforcements did get there, if the rest of a battle group showed up, yeah, we'd have a real fight on our hands, and it would quite possibly pose a real problem for the Vulcans. But again, they actually have that advantage in those small ships, and those small ships do a lot to, free up space and free up maneuvering for the capital ships, for the Dakir. So, I think that's an interesting observation to just bear in mind, is as much as, the big attention drawers in this engagement are the Dakirs and the Kumaris, the big capital ships. Actually, the ships that are really deciding this engagement are going to be the Ilithins, the Davals, and the Volcas. It's actually the smaller ships that will actually be deciding this engagement, because that's kind of where the imbalance lies. So those are really my thoughts. As I say, you've got essentially here two fleets with some interesting differences. The Andorians have a lot of strengths in ordnance, in range combat, and in armour. They are weak in their limited variety of ships, their smaller overall fleet size, and their low warp speed. They're not going to be as fast at warp compared to the Vulcans, who are going to have a lot of operational mobility. When a Vulcan fleet decides to go, it's going to go, and it's going to go fast, and you need to react to that. So, looking then at the Vulcans, we have strength in close quarter firepower, in the number and variety of ships, and in warp speed, in operational mobility. They are weak in ordnance, they are weak in the age of a lot of their classes, and a lot of their ships are not very maneuverable. What I really see here is, in this analysis, we can really see the Vulcan fleet it looks very impressive and very scary and very powerful for the 22nd century, but actually underlying it, it's relying a lot on older classes and actually on having a fair number of smaller vessels, because actually having such grossly oversized ships in this period, it's costly, and it can be difficult. You can just run into enemies that are just going to outpace you, and the Andorians knew to play on those weaknesses and counter them directly. So, in this individual engagement, I think the Vulcans would have pushed through. Possibly they would have then faced Andorian reinforcements. That's a debate. But in an overall warfighting capability, I think if forced onto the defensive, which may have not been very politically viable, but I think that would have actually favoured the Andorians quite a bit. I think they could have done very well by lying in wait, lying in ambush, and picking off the Vulcans, at their kind of pace. And you kind of have to. You can't really attack against the Vulcans because they have too much operational mobility. Their ships are too powerful and too fast to take in a head-on fight. You've got to adopt that defensive position, that defensive stance. Let them come to you. Let them start making mistakes, which Vulcans do. Vulcans do make mistakes, and that is how the Andorians could defeat the Vulcans. I don't think we were ever going to see Andorian ships in orbit above Vulcan. It's too hot for the starters. But there we go. That is my analysis of the Vulcan-Andorian conflict of the 22nd century and how it played out, or would have played out. So I hope you all enjoyed, and I will see you all in the next video. Thank you all for watching. I will now thank my members, my Navarchs, David Reeves, Jeffrey Ballard, and Tully DT, my commanders, Miami Jules, Captain's Quarters, Chase Rector, PQSK, Philip Ty, Jeff Hallam, Bird Monster, Mark Philippe, Robert Sampson, Sean Farrell, Guillermo Martinez, Das Blas, Adam Bowman, and Nathaniel Mead. And I salute my Centurions, Pendlebury, BOS Domestic Disputes, Marcus Hall, Paul Lash, Julian Arnott, Freedom Trooper, Oculcatum Questo, Squadra Course, and Gabe Logan. Thank you guys for supporting the channel, and I will see you all in the next video.